Hi everyone, welcome to week 14. We're talking about global health and the approaches to infectious disease and medical anthropology. So first of all, I just want to remind you, if you didn't see my announcement, that I decided to let you drop your 3 lowest reading response grades. So if you're missing some from early on, or if you have run out of time to be able to finish those, that will help you out a little bit. If you have some grades that you don't like, that will help you. I'm not going to change the final point value for what the reading responses are worth. I'll just average your scores so that if you have 4 responses that have 14s, I'll average out that you got 14s on your other ones and calculate the grade out of 70 points according to that. The other thing that I want to mention to you is to not forget, and it's the activity for you to work on for class this week, is thinking about how you're going to upload and present your final project to us via bblearn. So I posted some guidance on ways that you can do that. You can use Zoom to record yourself. You can use PowerPoint to record your voice over a PowerPoint slide presentation. If you're doing a podcast or something like that, you can post your podcast for us to listen to. So I would like you to upload your audio or video presentation for your final paper or your final project to the media gallery that's linked in our bblearn shell by May 1st at the very latest. So that's Friday. That's the day that most of you probably would have been doing your presentations in class, so that's not a change. If you can get them on there any earlier, that would be really welcome, so that your classmates have time during the week to watch them. If everyone doesn't post them until Friday night, then you'll all be watching them over the weekend, and I think that that's not ideal, but I'm not making it due until May 1st, but the earlier you can do it, the better. That's for week 16. So what I'm having the rest of you, well, all of you do for week 16 then is watch at least 6 of your classmates' presentations. And hopefully those will only be about 5 to 10 minutes each. And then just write some brief comments on them about what you learned. They don't need to be critical comments. I'm just looking for kind of like, what did you learn from their project or presentation? So I want it to be positive feedback. We don't really need any negative feedback at this point, I don't think. So if you have any concerns about that, please send me an email. We can try to adapt what's going to work for everyone. So make sure you're keeping in touch with me. I'd like you to watch those 6 classmate presentations and comment on them by May 3rd, if that is possible. If we need to extend that for some reason, will you please just stay in touch with me and let me know how that's going to go. I know that this is going to be probably a little bit bumpy doing all of our presentations online, and I understand that. So I'm trying to preempt that by having you think about it this week, start working on it this week as kind of the majority of your class work for this week. Start thinking about how we're going to do that presentation. And just know that I'm going to be flexible on it as much as I possibly can, because I know it's going to be a little bit tricky. All right, so this week in class, we're talking about infectious disease and global health. We were talking about global health already last week, so it's not a huge jump from what we were doing last week, but global health is a pretty gigantic aspect of medical anthropology, so we can't cover it all in just one week. So for this week, you have 3 articles to read. The first one is by Steinglass. It's called "It Takes a Village Healer," and it's about using traditional medicine practitioners to kind of help train them in countering AIDS, and also looking into how traditional medicine practitioners can kind of be influencing an epidemic like that, and how interesting those kinds of interactions are, and beliefs about what's spreading the illness, beliefs about cures, and things like that. The second one is by Svea Klosser, who's one of the editors of our book, and it's a real classic article in medical anthropology called "The Polio Eradication Initiative in Pakistan: Anthropological Perspectives on Why the World's Largest Global Health Program May Fail." And the idea behind that title is that in the 1990s, Svea Klosser will tell you more about this, there was a movement in sort of global medicine to eradicate some global infectious diseases. And the only one that has been successfully eradicated is smallpox. That one actually was wiped out. But there were several others, including polio, that we thought would be gone by now, that we thought having a vaccine or having a treatment would actually literally remove that disease from the population. Because if you could vaccinate enough children, you should be able to see that disease disappear from the human population. And we thought that that was going to happen, but it hasn't been very successful. And Speyer-Klosser sort of looks into why that is from a medical anthropological perspective. The third one is by Kalafonos, who was briefly featured in the video that we watched last week, talking about people saying all I eat is ARVs, and ARV is short for antiretroviral medication. That's the medications that people take for HIV/AIDS. That is about the paradox of AIDS treatment interventions. So medical anthropologists, as you know, are often looking at kind of systemic issues, contextual issues, people in their context. So if you're giving someone access to medication for free, but they don't have the food to eat, to take it with, then do they take it? How do they understand that? There's all kinds of questions that medical anthropology has been involved in actually working with global health campaigns to solve some of these problems. So just really quick, before I talk about what infectious disease looks like in medical anthropology and global health, remembering what anthropology is. So anthropology is the study of human similarities and differences, and it often is taking a really holistic approach, looking at culture, looking at context, so what kinds of elements are impacting people. This is really related to the social determinants of health framework and public health, so what are kind of from the individual to the policy level, what are all the things that sort of constrain or facilitate individuals' behavior in a community? Complexity. We look at issues as being very complex. You can't boil it down to just people need more education or people need access to medication. There's usually tons of different factors interacting to decide whether someone has access, whether someone's at risk for an infectious disease, etc. We're looking at cross-cultural comparisons. So often the purpose of anthropology is to try to counter ideas of human universals. So everybody does this. This is a human universal. And usually anthropologists are kind of in the mode of saying, well, hold on, here's an example where that's not quite the case. So does that disprove the whole theory? Does it mean we need to rethink it a little bit? So really pushing against the idea of trying to come up with human universals in health and psychology and things like that. And then anthropology is also very interested in change, in globalization and how that impacts people. So anthropology in global health does not assume that individuals are the best level of analysis for understanding health behaviors, as often public health does, although public health's been getting a lot better in the last 20 years or so. Anthropology does not assume that individuals freely choose their behavior. So we're looking a lot at constraint. We rarely accept education as the main thing that needs to be done, because although sometimes individuals are in need of access to education, public education, that's a different issue than educating people about health behaviors. So what other kinds of things are constraining people's choices are often what we're looking at. Anthropology does not assume that the environment is fixed and does not assume that the environment is separate from human behavior. So often the environment that people encounter is linked to human behavior. So are people encountering pollution? Are they encountering green space to be able to exercise in? So if you tell someone they need to go jogging, do they have a space to do that? If you tell someone that they need to wash their hands to avoid a communicable disease, do they have running water? Do they have access to kind of the things that you're saying that they need to do? So if you tell everyone you need to wear a mask, can people access masks? That kind of thing. The other thing that anthropology does not assume is that quantitative data is the only kind of real data. We really push against the idea that the only kind of data that's valid or that's useful is quantitative big data, and that people's accounts of their own experience are just anecdotal. We don't make that generalization because often statistics is just as open to interpretation, just as open to cherry picking, and you miss out on why people do what they do. So often we're interested in that, and if you don't take people's perspectives into account, you can't really actually explain that very well. Anthropology and global health does assume that culture is important. So culture, we are not trying to say that people have one single cultural membership that dictates everything that they do, but that beliefs are important, context is important, the ways people are socialized are important, the ways that different cultures interact are important. Anthropology does assume that human behavior makes more sense if you view it from a person's own perspective. So we're often very interested in what are people thinking about what they're doing? How are people interpreting public health messages? Why aren't people interested in a public health message and things like that? Anthropologists do assume that interacting social, political, and economic factors constrain behavior and choice. And also that societies have become more unequal over time. So we're often looking at the products of inequality. When you look at infectious disease, how is inequality involved in that? When we talk about infectious disease, often biological models or public health models will look at a pathogen, and that if you come into contact with a pathogen, you'll get sick. So there's lots of things that we can do to prevent that. But there are lots of, excuse me, there are lots of ways that people are unequally at risk. So your likelihood of coming into contact with a pathogen depends on all kinds of factors. So right now, for example, in our context, I can do my full-time job from home. That's not true for everybody. So that's a product of inequality that changes the level of risk that people face in a very important way. There are lots of other factors like that too, like access to treated water, access to clean water, access to things to boil your water, access to transportation that's not with lots of other people. Whatever it is, there's lots and lots of ways that inequality is really, really important in the study of global health and in the spread of infectious disease. So in global health, medical anthropologists, so nearly all anthropologists that someone working in global health would interact with is a medical anthropologist. That's where medical anthropology is. Not many anthropologists who aren't medical anthropologists are working in global health. But not all medical anthropologists are interested in global health. So global health is just one piece of medical anthropology, just one area of medical anthropology. Applied medical anthropologists often act as cultural brokers or cultural interpreters. And what they're really interested in most of the time is local communities and how local communities are interacting with global initiatives or health or public health, or how global initiatives impact people on the local level. Anthropologists in global health really emphasize partnerships with local communities, community involvement, interdisciplinary work. So you would rarely find, although traditionally in cultural anthropology, anthropologists often work alone. They go to a community and they work there alone and try to understand the culture. Medical anthropologists, especially in global health, are much more interested in big interdisciplinary collaboration. And then respect for local people is one of the biggest things. There's an anthropologist named Charles Briggs, who's currently the president of the Society for Medical Anthropology, who wrote an article about why journalists and public health messages can sometimes have a really hard time reaching people with public health campaigns. And his research is on cholera transmission in Venezuela. And what he found was that they were putting up flyers in Venezuela that said things like, if you're living in a squalor, you're more at risk of cholera. If you're dirty, you're more at risk of cholera. And they weren't maybe quite that blatant, but what he argued is that if you're targeting an audience, you have to make sure that your target, your message, is actually reaching the audience. Because if you read a poster and it says, if you live in a dirty house, you're more likely to get cholera, you're not going to think, well, this poster is directed at me. You're going to think, well, I don't live in a dirty house. I'm not this person. So that's not going to reach the person if the way that it's characterizing the person who's at risk doesn't actually seem to be the person who's reading your poster. The other thing that anthropologists are arguing in global health is that we have to understand cultural beliefs and practices on both sides of the equation. So not just what are the local cultural beliefs that prevent public health campaigns from being accepted, although that's something that you would often hear about. But also, what are the cultural assumptions embedded in the programs, embedded in the campaigns, embedded in the global health initiatives that are problematic and that prevent them from being relevant at the local level? So we're not just looking at trying to change local people. So one of the ideas in public health is that public health is often trying to get people to do what they don't want to do. And what medical anthropologists are often more interested in is, why do we want them to do that? And is there a way that it could be done that's more relevant at the local level and that's meaningful to people and that they want to do? Because trying to get people to do what they don't want to do kind of goes counter to the central tenets of anthropology. So anthropology and infectious disease, as you'll read about, looks particularly at how risk is characterized at a population level and then how people interpret their own level of risk in relation to that and what that makes them do. So you've probably been observing some interesting things about this with our COVID-19 pandemic situation right now. How do people conceptualize their risk in relation to this? Do they assume that everybody is putting them at risk? Do they assume that they're not really at risk? How do they conceptualize that? So that's one of the areas that medical anthropologists are all over studying right now. Another thing is how and why people are at risk of infection and how you could prevent it in a way that people are actually willing to do. What kinds of structural and environmental factors put some people at greater risk than others? So I mentioned that. And then, like in the Steinglass article, how ethnomedicine can be involved in treatment or transmission of infectious disease. How public health messages are interpreted and why they don't always work is an important piece that medical anthropologists are often involved in. And then how to engage people in reducing transmission of infectious disease in ways that make sense to them and that are relevant and meaningful in a local context. So that's just a super, super brief overview of global health. Hopefully you'll enjoy the readings. I think some of them probably do a nicer overview of global health and infectious disease than I'm doing. For next week, I'll post some things in the module. It just says wrapping up. So it'll be more kind of review things, kind of overviews of medical anthropology. But mostly what I want you to do for next week, and a lot for this week, is to be working on your final projects. Don't leave that till the last minute. Be working on them now because it should be a pretty big project and you do need to do that class presentation of it. So start that now as your classwork for this week and next week in this class. Start working on your final project. If you're not sure what to do, send me an email now. Don't wait until the day before and say, what should I do? Email me now and make a plan. Start planning. That's what I want you to do as your activity for this week, is plan out what is your final project and how are you going to present it? How are you going to present it to me and how are you going to present it to the class? So for this week, the last thing that I'm asking you to do is participate in the discussion board and watch the TED Talk by Melinda Gates. So Melinda Gates, you know, is not an anthropologist, but her message in this TED Talk, I think, is really interesting for us to think about when we're looking at global public health campaigns. So after you watch this video, think about how it relates, especially to the Closser article about polio. What might Melinda Gates' message about Coca-Cola have added to that campaign in Pakistan? And could modeling a campaign after Coke's marketing be relevant for what we're talking about in medical anthropology? So in your responses to the discussion leaders for this week, I'd like you to think about that as well. Think about relating it to the Melinda Gates talk and what maybe people in your generation can add to what's been done in the past, especially because we see not only a lot of these infectious diseases still around when we thought that they wouldn't be, but also new ones emerging and creating some pretty big global concern. So I just want you to think about that while you watch that Melinda Gates TED Talk. And as usual, please feel free to email me anytime. I'm happy to hear from you. I'm happy to review things. I'm happy to set up a time that we can talk on Zoom if you would like to talk sort of face-to-face. I'm not requiring that, but I'm happy to do that. So please stay in touch with me. And I hope you have a great week.